On a quiet April afternoon in 1934, 8-year-old Helen Priestly left her cramped tenement home in the Scottish city of Aberdeen to perform a simple task, buying a loaf of bread for her mother. The trip to the local bakery was one she had made many times before. However, this time the journey would be one from which she'd never return. What followed was one of Scotland's most chilling and controversial murder cases. A web of suspicion, a bitter family feud, pioneering forensic science, and at the heart of it all, an unlikely suspect. A neighbour whose life would be forever changed by a crime that would shake an entire community. In 1930s Aberdeen, life was often hard. Families lived in cold rooms, cramped spaces, and the constant difficulty of poverty. The city's working-class families were packed into aging tenement blocks where privacy was a luxury few could afford and where tempers often ran high. It was in one such block at 61 Urquhart Street that the Priestly and Donald families lived, neighbours whose lives would soon become tragically entwined. John and Agnes Priestly had a small two-room flat, a modest home where they raised their daughter Helen. Helen Priestly was an 8-year-old girl known to those around her as bright and curious, though she could also be stubborn and difficult. She had a reputation for being mischievous, sometimes even unruly, with the main target of her disruptive behaviour being the family living directly below them, the Donalds. Jeannie and Alexander Donald occupied the middle flat, along with their young daughter, also named Jeannie. Alexander worked as a barber. He was quiet but reliable and well regarded for his skill. His 38-year-old wife, Jeannie, was a housewife who spent her days tending to the home and caring for their daughter. Relations between the Priestleys and the Donalds were tense, and Helen often seemed to be at the centre of it. Several neighbours would later report that Helen had tormented the Donald family repeatedly, kicking at their front door, rattling the stairwell banisters, shouting insults at Jeannie Donald, and bullying the younger girl. More than once, Jeannie had been seen shouting at Helen in the street, clearly fed up with the child's antics. It was no secret that she disliked the girl and that Helen knew it. But at 8 years old, Helen's behaviour could be explained. She was a mischievous child, prone to pushing boundaries the way children often are. Jeannie Donald, however, was not a child. She was a grown woman, a wife and mother. Yet it didn't take much to provoke her. Jeannie too had a reputation, not for violence, but for bitterness. Her temper was well documented among her neighbours, as were her grievances. Petty disputes, rumours, and long-held resentments were all part of the tenement life, but Jeannie seemed to carry them longer than most. Whether it was over noise, borrowed items, or children like Helen, she remembered slights, and she didn't forgive easily. Neighbours had seen Jeannie shouting at Helen in the street, scowling at her, and even chasing the child off like a stray animal. To some, it seemed excessive, even strange, especially given that she had a daughter roughly the same age as Helen. The two young girls also clashed, echoing the growing tensions between the families. Helen's mischievous streak didn't help. Some said she went out of her way to antagonize the older Jeannie Donald. Others thought the feud was mutual. What's certain is that by the spring of 1934, the tension between the families was more than just a neighbourly spat. It was personal. But while the animosity between them was well known, no one could have predicted that these everyday tensions would soon explode into a tragedy that would haunt Aberdeen for decades to come. On Saturday, April the 21st, 1934, Agnes Priestly realised she was nearly out of bread. It was a small thing and easily remedied, and so she sent her 8-year-old daughter Helen to buy a fresh loaf from the cooperative bakery just around the corner. Helen went without complaint. The route to the bakery was familiar and the distance was short, but Helen never came home. As the minutes turned into hours, unease turned into panic. With no sign of their daughter, her parents, neighbours and friends knew something was terribly wrong. This wasn't a child who had gotten lost. She hadn't wandered off. She had been taken. Her mother Agnes raised the alarm, and within hours the entire neighbourhood was mobilised. Police and dozens of residents, men, women, children, combed the streets of Aberdeen in growing desperation. It wasn't uncommon in those days for a child to be gone for an hour or two, but something about this felt different. Later that afternoon, a breakthrough seemed to come from a surprising source. 9-year-old Dick Sutton, a friend of Helen's, came forward with a disturbing account. He claimed that earlier that day he'd seen her being dragged down the street by a rough-looking man in a dark overcoat. The man, he said, had forced a frightened and struggling Helen onto a nearby tram. The police acted immediately. A description of the alleged kidnapper was circulated and the search radius expanded into the outer reaches of Aberdeen. Radio bulletins described the girl and the suspect in detail. Local cinemas interrupted their showings to flash alerts across the screen. An early version of an Amber Alert in an era when the family radio and the local theatre were the epicenters of news and entertainment. At the same time, Helen's father was out scouring the streets alongside his neighbour, Alexander Parker. The two men searched into the night, and at around 2 a.m., emotionally and physically drained, Helen's father finally allowed himself to return home and rest. Parker saw him inside, offered what small comfort he could to Agnes, and returned to his own flat. 3 hours later, at 5 a.m., Parker woke up to resume the search. When he got to the Priestleys, however, something caught his eye. Something that hadn't been there just a few hours earlier. Beneath the stairs in the hallway of 61 Urquhart Street was a large blue Hessian sack. Under ordinary circumstances, he might have passed it by. But this was far from an ordinary morning. The city was on edge. A child was missing, and something about the bag felt deeply wrong. Parker opened the sack, and inside was Helen. Her body had been forced into the sack, limp and lifeless. It would soon be revealed that she had been strangled. Her underwear was missing, and there were bruises on her thighs, evidence of sexual assault. As shock and horror spread through the community, the police clung to the early witness account. The man on the tram dragging the girl, the dark coat, the frantic expression on her face. But something didn't sit right. The logistics alone were unlikely. It didn't seem feasible that someone would drag a struggling child onto a tram in full view of the public in the middle of the day. And the more the police looked into the story, the less it held together. Under pressure and after hours of questioning, young Dick Sutton confessed that he had made the whole thing up. There had been no mysterious kidnapper, no man in a coat, no tram. The story had sent police and the public chasing shadows, while the real scene of interest, Helen's home, had been left unexamined. Sutton's false lead had derailed the investigation at a crucial time, and with Helen's body discovered just feet from where she lived, suspicion turned much closer to home. The police began to rethink their theory, and perhaps the killer hadn't returned to 61 Urquhart Street, but instead had never left. One detail pointed strongly to that possibility: the sack. The sack Helen's body was found in was completely dry. And this was no small detail. Aberdeen had been soaked by heavy rain during the night. If Helen's body had been outside or even dragged through the city streets in that bag, it should have been drenched. But it wasn't. Which meant only one thing. The killer had returned between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. entered the building and placed the bag deliberately beneath the stairs. The killer hadn't just carelessly disposed of the body, they had planted it. As investigators continued to interview the building's residents, it became clear that tensions existed between the Priestleys and the family below them, the Donalds. Neighbours reported that Jeannie Donald, the matriarch, had often shouted at young Helen for her mischief. Helen had bullied the Donalds' daughter, kicked at their door and shouted abuse at Jeannie. One thing everyone seemed to notice was that the Donald family had not participated in the search for Helen, which struck investigators as odd given that the entire community combed through the streets to look for the missing girl. As scrutiny turned towards the Donalds, police found further cause for suspicion when their attention shifted to the blue Hessian sack in which Helen's body had been found. The bag had a Canadian flour export mark and was stained with soot and saucepan rings, leading investigators to believe it had been reused as a tablecloth. A local baker confirmed that Jeannie Donald had asked for and taken similar flour sacks. A neighbour also reported hearing a child scream around 1:30 p.m. on the day Helen disappeared, a scream corroborated by a slater working nearby. Investigators now believed Helen may have returned to the building but never made it past the Donalds' flat. A search of their home revealed 9 identical sacks, all bearing similar stains. More disturbingly, blood of Helen's type was found on cleaning rags, a scrubbing brush and soap flakes. Forensic expert Sir Sidney Smith confirmed the presence of a rare bacterium across the Donald household, one that was uniquely associated with Helen due to a rare medical condition. The same bacteria were found on the floor, cloths and countertops. Initially, Alexander Donald was arrested but quickly ruled out after dozens of witnesses confirmed he had been at work. That left only one suspect, Jeannie Donald. The arrest was supported by evidence when microscopic analysis of the sack's dust revealed traces of cotton, wool, cat hair, rabbit hair, and human hair that matched the accused. Jeannie was arrested and charged with murder, and her trial began at Edinburgh High Court on July 16, 1934, before Judge Lord Craig Mason Aitchison. Her defence was simple. She could not have physically committed the sexual aspect of the crime, but further forensic tests raised doubts about whether any had occurred at all. Sir Sidney Smith noted the absence of semen and concluded that the bruising and abrasions were likely caused by the handle of a broom or hammer, tools used to stage a sexual assault and shift blame. The jury took only 18 minutes to return a guilty verdict, and Jeannie Donald was sentenced to death. Lord Aitchison, who had never sentenced a woman to death before, was reportedly brought to tears as he passed the sentence. An appeal against the sentence was lodged on August 3, 1934, but with the overwhelming and damning evidence, not to mention the cruel nature of the crime against a child, very few held out hope that Jeannie would ever be able to escape the consequences of her own actions. Despite the brutality of the crime, a letter from the Secretary of State arrived at the office of Aberdeen's Lord Provost Henry Alexander, ordering that Donald's death sentence be commuted to life imprisonment. Jeannie became a model prisoner, and when her husband Alexander Donald was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 1944, Jeannie was granted compassionate leave to care for him. After his death, she remained free. She lived under an assumed name and died in 1976 at the age of 81, never once speaking publicly about the murder. Now, decades later, people continue to theorize about the motive behind the crime. Some believe Jeannie wanted revenge against the Priestly family. Others claim she tried to frame her husband, but the most likely scenario is more tragic. Pushed to the edge By Helen's persistent teasing, Jeannie may have finally snapped and lashed out. It's been speculated by some that what really happened was that Helen was playing ding-dong ditch, ringing the Donald's doorbell and running off. Jeannie hid under the stairs, and when Helen went to do it again, she leapt out and frightened Helen so severely that she choked on her own vomit. Helen suffered from a medical condition, an enlarged thymus gland, which would also have made her prone to fainting. It's possible that Jeannie then staged the scene to make it appear like a sexually motivated killing. In the end, Helen's case made history. Jeannie Donald became one of the first people in the world to be convicted based on forensic evidence. It's an early example of science stepping in where witness accounts and suspicions couldn't. But for all the headlines and breakthroughs, the horror of it remained the same. A child was gone, and no amount of justice could bring her back. Whatever arguments or tensions may have existed between neighbours, nothing could explain or excuse the cruelty of what happened to Helen Priestly, and the crime remains a dark chapter in Aberdeen's history. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.